The Essendon and Hawthorn football clubs are one of the league's most ferocious rivalries, with its history largely stemming from a series of brutal clashes, especially come grand final day in the 1980s. These teams had no love lost against them, with even the coaches in Alan Jeans and Kevin Sheedy forming a rivalry against one another. Not to be outdone, Hawthorn's superstar captain at the time, Leigh Matthews, would go on to form his own coaching rivalry with Sheeds once he began his career. There were player rivalries with characters such as Brerrerton and Duckworth, who would symbolise the ferocity between these two teams. But unlike, say, North Melbourne in the 70s, Essendon would last as an enduring rivalry for Hawthorn that has continued to eventuate in some absolute brutal clashes. While the grand finals between Essendon and Hawthorn from 1983 to 85 were where this rivalry was at its absolute pinnacle, it would be incorrect to ignore the histories of these two teams in the previous 57 years and in the years afterwards. Hawthorn and Essendon would first meet against one another at Glenferrie Oval in 1925 in round 8. Essendon had already established themselves as one of the league's original superpowers, the reigning premiers of 1925, having won the round-robin series in 1924. They already had 6 premierships to their name. The Mayblooms, as the Hawks were originally known, were the new kids on the block, entering the league alongside North Melbourne and Footscray in 1925. In their first encounter in that year, it would be a tight match for these two clubs, as Essendon would claim the initial bragging rights by 13 points. For much of their early histories, though, Hawthorn were an afterthought for Essendon. The same olds and later the Bombers were a league power, especially through the 1940s and early 50s, where under Dick Reynolds they would win 4 more premierships between 1942 and 50, and be a regular finals team during that era. For Hawthorn, though, they were a struggler, the whipping boys of the league. For the first 17 years of their existence, they would never win more than 7 games in a season. Between 1944 and 1953, the club would finish on the bottom or second bottom in every year but one. It wouldn't be until 1957 that Hawthorn would finally make finals. Although they went out, the tide was about to turn. In 1960, the United States elected John F. Kennedy, who would transform America. But Hawthorn would have their own John Kennedy, who took the reins for the Hawks. Hawthorn would narrowly miss finals in 1960. In 61, they broke through for their first ever premiership. Essendon would go on to win another 2 flags in the 60s in 62 and 65, but would fade down the ladder in the 1970s, while Hawthorn would establish themselves as a league power. It was in the 70s, though, that the first hints of rivalry between Hawthorn and Essendon began to emerge. In June 1978, there was an aerial battle that broke out between the Hawks and the Bombers, with their stars Peter Knights and Paul VanderHar lining up on one another. They would have an aerial combat between one another. The 80s, though, is where these two teams came to find a real disliking for one another. In 1981, Kevin Sheedy would take the Essendon job as their head coach, a role he would have until 2007. After a lackluster 70s, Essendon would re-emerge under Sheedy as a league powerhouse. That same year, the league would experiment with interstate matches. Hawthorn and Essendon would meet at the Gabba. 2 teams slugged it out between one another, and signs of becoming ferocity would be noted when Essendon's Ron Andrews knocked Hawthorn's Robert Dipperminico out. The points would go to the Bombers in this match, winning by 19 points, with Simon Madden kicking 7 goals in what was a high-scoring affair. The next year, Windy Hill, Lethal Leigh would lead the way for Hawthorn, coming back from a third-quarter deficit. Hawthorn kicked 7 goals in the last quarter, and Leigh made his presence known.
The post is broken, Matthews hit it, and broke the point post. Oh, talk about a he-man. How was that? He split it right down in half. A fantastic effort by Leigh Matthews.
These encounters in 81 and 82, though, were merely a warm-up to 83. From 1983 to 85, Hawthorn and Essendon were the 2 best teams in the competition, facing off in 3 consecutive grand finals between each other, with a match in between those matches also being some epic affairs. Both sides had defeated one another convincingly in their encounters in 1983. Hawthorn had defeated Essendon by 42 points in round 8. And the rough encounters between these sides were emerging when Dipperminico knocked out Alan Stoneman, leading to a half-time brawl between each other. Essendon weren't about to let this be forgotten after the half-time break, and they took out some revenge to Leigh Matthews. They would meet again in round 19, and this time it would be Essendon reversing the fortunes, winning by 46 points. Dipper's knock to Stoneman had not been forgotten by the Bombers either, and, well, when Cameron Leighton came off the ground, well, he made sure that Dipper would feel his presence, striking him in the face. The 1983 grand final between these two sides would be Essendon's first grand final since 1968. For Bombers, it seemed they were merely happy to be there, although an early knee injury to star Gary Buchanara would rule him out for the rest of the game. The Hawks would rampage in the second quarter with 7 goals in the second term, led by Leigh Matthews, who would kick 6 goals in a grand effort. Colin Robertson would star with the Norm Smith medalists, and Hawthorn had 10 individual goal scorers. In the third quarter, they added 4 more, keeping the Dons scoreless. This match would be remembered with Colin Robertson knocking Essendon star Tim Watson to the ground. This did lead to a fire-up for Essendon and led to a bit of a brawl. At the end of the day, though, it'd be the greatest onslaught in grand final history at that point, as the Hawks won by 83 points. Essendon, though, would be seeking redemption in 1984, and Kevin Sheedy would go off at his side after many felt contempt to have simply made the grand final following the loss. For Sheedy, a product of Richmond dynasties of the 60s and 70s, the second was not good enough enshrined into their mindset, well, he brought this to Essendon. In 1984, the rivalry between these two clubs grew from strength to strength. If there is one year to define the rivalry between these two teams, it's 1984. Meeting in round 2 for the first time that year, the grand final rematch was a much better game than the grand decider, in a tight contest at Windy Hill that saw the Bombers up by a point at quarter time, 10 points at half time, before Hawthorn asserted themselves in the third quarter with 7 goals to lead by 20 points at the main break. Essendon would fight back, but they would go down by 6 points. It'd be the semi-final, which Kevin Sheedy would describe as one of the all-time great games.
People say it was a great game.
That was one of the best games I've ever been involved in. Tough game, right to the siren.
Hawthorn would get the initial lead through an early flurry of goals, including a terrific one from Dipperminico. It would be a seesawing game from therein, a shootout between the sides, with the Hawks taking the lead by 5 points at halftime, following a goal from Brerrerton. Essendon would lead by a point at 3/4 time, but only following a crucial goal from Leigh Matthews. Another crucial goal at the 24-minute mark of the fourth quarter that put Hawthorn in front by 2 points. It'd be a harrowing final 5 minutes of the match. The Hawks managed to hold on until a pass from Colin Robertson would land in the hands of Rodney Heed, who kicked truly on the siren. The Hawks had won, but only just. They went to the grand final. Essendon coach Kevin Sheedy would stem some controversy between the clubs when Sheedy made some accusations of drug taking with what Hawthorn was sniffing, leading to, well, some confiscation and police investigation. This did not go down well with Hawthorn's coach Alan Jeans, who was a police sergeant. It was to be a rematch of 1983, Hawthorn versus Essendon, and at first it seemed like it very well may be a repeat of a year before, with Hawthorn getting the initial run with 4 quick goals before Essendon could even whimper. The same suspects that caused misery in 83 in Matthews and Robertson, starring early. To stir Hawthorn's momentum, Sheeds would send a message out to Simon Madden to start a fight, and a brawl between the clubs would break out. In the second quarter, Essendon would start to stem the bleeding, gaining more possession, but before kicking in front of goals would see them only score 1 goal for the quarter, while Hawthorn would increase their lead by 32 points by half-time. The third quarter of the match was a low-scoring affair, and Essendon superstar Simon Madden was not languishing on the bench for most of the quarter, getting within 3 goals before a crucial goal to Brerrerton would extend the lead to 23 points at 3/4 time. The Hawks were feeling anxious and looking tired. It was this game that would make Sheedy's name legend when it came to coaching, as he made some positional changes such as moving Paul Weston to centre half forward, Terry Danniher to defence, and Peter Bradbury to the forward line. And boy would these moves pay off. Essendon would get to the perfect start coming the beginning of the fourth quarter. Madden was back on the ground and won the opening bounce with a ball moving to Essendon's forward half. The ball would land in the hands of Liam Baker, and he kicked the first goal of the quarter, beginning an Essendon rampage. Peter Bradbury would follow with another goal soon after. They kicked 4 goals within 5 minutes, with Liam Baker kicking the goal to put Essendon in front. The momentum was with Essendon. Dipperminico would try to stem Essendon's flow with a knock to Walsh, but Essendon would just keep rampaging, kicking 9 goals 6 in the final quarters. It would be Essendon's first flag since 1965, breaking a 19-year premiership drought. This premiership was Kevin Sheedy's premiership and would begin the Sheedy dynasty. In 1985, it was seen befitting to match these two clubs against one another to start the VFL season, a week earlier than the rest of the competition. Hawthorn had a new star, so they fought with Steve Malacossi from WA, but he was a disappointment. It was a tight game. It would be most remembered for the time-wasting rule, with Essendon Roger Merritt the first victim of it. Both of these home and away games in 1985 were played at VFL Park, reflecting the blockbuster matches that these games had become. The night grand final in 85 would also be a face-off between Essendon and Hawthorn. Both teams would be missing their captains, Leigh Matthews having been deregistered following the Neville Bruns incident, and Terry Danniher injured. A close affair for the entirety of the match, with the Hawks winning by 11 points. Once again, they met twice in the final series. In the semi-finals, well, it would be a convincing win for Essendon. Of course, there were brawls, but for Essendon this was merely a warm-up for the grand final, in what was the third consecutive year that the two sides met in a grand final. With a rivalry often defined by big brawls and biffs between these sides, there would be no bigger brawl than in the 1985 grand final, where it seemed that every player on the ground was involved, piling on to one another. Although the first half would be a contested affair between the two sides, the second half saw Essendon go on a rampage. Simon Madden dominated, and Hawthorn had no answer to him, as Madden kept feeding the ball to Essendon's midfielders, and with an even more impressive fourth quarter in 1985, Essendon kicked 11 goals, with the final score being one of the highest in grand final history, with 170 points to Essendon and Hawthorn 92. A victory of 78 points. For Hawthorn, Dermott Brerrerton would be a highlight, putting an impressive display as he did everything to keep Hawthorn in it with 8 goals, the second most goals ever kicked by an individual in a grand final. Essendon's shooting star, though, Paul Salmon, would be no slouch with goals either, with 6 goals. It'd be Hawthorn legend Leigh Matthews' last game, who tearfully would be carried off the ground after 340 matches. After 1984, it would be 8 more years until Essendon won a premiership, while Hawthorn would establish the 80s as the Hawthorn decade, playing in every grand final between 83 and 91, bar 1990. Both clubs would have some of the biggest characters in the game, and in 1988, Bill Duckworth and Dermott Brerrerton seemed to be getting to know one another on a more intimate basis, until Brerrerton was penalised for this, and Dermy and Rage would decide to run through the Essendon huddle. The clubs would meet again in the finals clash in 1989, but Dermy loved playing Essendon and made his presence known with a bump to Paul VanderHar. The Hawks would gain control in the second half and ran on to a 36-point lead for another grand final appearance. After the 1991 victory for Hawthorn, legends like Dipperminico, John Kennedy and Tuck retired. The golden age of Hawks was over. While they still made finals, they were not the same club. The glory days were over. In 1992, seeming Essendon's era was also at a close, with Simon Madden, Terry Danniher and Tim Watson retiring. But a new breed of bomber was emerging, and Watson didn't stay retired for long. The baby boomers flew up in the 90s, and Essendon would remain a titan through the decade. In 2001, Hawthorn was in final contention, and would make it all the way to the preliminary final. You gave Hawthorn a chance against Essendon, and at half-time it seemed the Bombers were going to cruise their way to another grand final. The Hawks would fight valiantly, trailing by 6 goals at half-time. they managed to keep Essendon goalless in the third quarter, while kicking free themselves to trail by only 15 points. The Hawks kept coming and were within 4 points at one stage, but the Bombers were a team of champions and would find something, holding on to win the match by 9 points. The 2000s would see a new spark in the rivalry, first through this prelim, but more notably through the line in the sand match in round 11, 2004. Trailing by 32 points at halftime, Hawthorn club director Dermott Brerrerton reportedly told the Hawks to draw a line in the sand, but no longer would they take the Bomber intimidation. A physical stand was needed. In the third quarter, well, it seemed more like 1984 than 2004, with brawls and fights breaking out amongst Hawthorn and Essendon players, with jumper punches, wrestling and fists thrown. Commentators described it as
this is the 1980s revisited.
Well, I tell you what, at least Hawthorn is showing a bit of spirit here.
with an unprecedented amount of players reported, 18 players on 26 charges. 5 players were suspended and players in the melee fined. Although Essendon won convincingly, the 10th consecutive win over the Hawks, it would seem to mark a reversal in fortunes for the clubs. Essendon dropped away and went through a period that would become their darkest in the coming decades, while Hawthorn would re-emerge as a league superpower in the late 2000s through the 2010s, winning 4 premierships between 2008 and 2015, including a hat-trick of flags between 2013 and 15. For Essendon, 2004 would be the last time they would win a final, having not won one since. In 2009, the final match of the season would also see some violence again erupt, following Matthew Lloyd knocking out Brad Sewell, leading to a brawl immediately after. Numerous Hawthorn players would look to line up Lloyd following this incident, with Chance Bateman clotheslining him. Essendon would go on to win this match, coming from behind to secure a final spot and win by 17 points. But tensions brimmed, and Hawthorn coach Alistair Clarkson allegedly had to be restrained from approaching Lloyd post-match, with Campbell Brown post-match calling Lloyd one of the biggest snipers in the game. This match would be Lloyd's last ever game, a sad way for one of the game's greatest forwards to end his careers. Throughout the 2010s, there would be a few moments that would be memorable. Buddy Franklin in 2010 would produce some magic going on a run, and he left Cale Hooker in the rear to kick goal of the year. Hawthorn would win the match by 16 points. This would be Hawthorn's second goal of a year in a row, following Sirioli, who had won it in 2009. Again, against Essendon. There would be some tight matches in the 2010s. In round 2, 2014, the reigning premiers were in some trouble, with Essendon having some second half momentum and Luke Hodge injured. The Bombers looked like they could pull off an upset. Hawthorn fought back, and it would be Cyril who would pull off some last-minute magic to win the match. But exactly a year later, it was Essendon's turn to break Hawthorn's hearts, with Cale Hooker, the unlikely hero for the Bombers, snapping the winning goal in the final minute of the match to win by 2 points. There'd be an infamous incident later that year, with Essendon still reeling from the drug scandal. Hawthorn's Sam Mitchell would make a jab gesture to the Essendon players, taking aim at the drug scandal. Soon though, Essendon would be convicted by WADA and 34 players suspended. Joe Watson, who had won the 2012 Brownlow medal, would actually have to hand his medal back, and it would be Sam Mitchell, along with Richmond's Trent Cotchin, who would be presented as a result. In round 1 2021, the Hawks and Bombers would meet in a thrilling battle between the sides that would come down to the haywire. After trailing by 40 points, Hawthorn fought back to win the match by a point. Hawthorn and Essendon are two of the league's most ferocious rivals, and have always found a way to hate each other since the 80s, no matter where the teams are positioned on the ladder, and surely will continue to do so in the future. Thank you guys, and if you enjoyed this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more.